It's really an honor and privilege for all of us to be here today and to share our enthusiasm, our wonder, and our sense of gratification with you in this evolution of an extraordinary field. So over the course of our conversations over the last week or so, as we were preparing for today's talk, we have looked over the histories of our respective institutions, Guggenheim Museum and the Museum of Modern Art primarily, also the Hirshhorn and Dallas and other museums that Allan works with. And we find that there have been very specific and important moments of engagement with Japan and with post-war Japanese art specifically, but somehow it's taken until now to build up a momentum. So the question is, what were those moments and why the momentum now? When I organized the first retrospective of Yayoi Kusama in 1989 in New York, and later the survey of post-war Japanese art, Scream Against the Sky, which I think we'll hear a little bit more about later, in 1994, there was no body of scholarship on modern and contemporary Japanese art in the West. No critical discourse or theoretical approach devoted to the creative production of art made by Japanese artists. There was no ready canon and virtually no connoisseurship of the kind that Allan is now offering to all of us and to his dealers, to his collectors. Scream Against the Sky, when I was doing research, I'll never forget driving up to an artist's house outside Kobe, and he was there in the summer sun, hosing down the picture that I was there to see because mold had grown on it, and he had the garden hose on the painting. So, you know, we've come a long way. Those of us engaged with Japanese art, you know, we all come from a kind of an existential background. So the existential questions before us are, we want to know how we got here, where we're going, and why it matters. So Allan, I'm going to start with you. Why Japanese art now? What's this all about?
Well, I could speak first about how I came to it, which is through the activities of the Rachofsky collection, which I've been working on for 15 years. It's a collection of a man named Howard Rachofsky and his wife Cindy, who about 16 years ago was a typical collector of contemporary art, but had built a house designed by Richard Meyer that turns out to be a masterpiece of the architect. And when he finished it, he realized that he had built more than a house, but a serious piece of architecture. Decided at that point that he wanted to become more serious about his art collecting. Early on in this process, I would say probably it was more than 12 years ago, it was probably 13 or 14 years ago, a dealer showed us an image of a very great and significant painting by Janis Kunelis from the early 60s, which was a breakthrough work that defined that moment when he's leaving painting and going into sculpture. And we went to visit the collector to see that painting, and as we're looking at it, there's this painting hanging opposite it that starts to attract our eye, and we didn't know what it was. And we learned it was by Shozo Shimamoto, an artist whose work we knew nothing about. Quite recently, in the last few years, I think principally because a generation of American curators and dealers who did study in Japan and have focused on this material are now coming of age themselves and presenting it. It became quite clear to us that there was a whole movement and a development that that was meaningful for us to explore, and that there were opportunities in the marketplace that might not be there for all that much longer.
Doryun, I'd love to start with you. You know, how did you come to Japanese art?
Part of it is my own cultural heritage, and I was interested in learning more about what is the history, the very complicated history of modern art, especially in East Asia.
Mika, why don't you tell us also what was sort of the kikake? What was the start of all this? And for your focus on Monoha.
Well, I think it's partially personal and, you know, part of my kind of upbringing, being from Los Angeles, and I was born. My mother was an artist who came to the U.S. in the late 1967, and there was a very, very small community of Japanese American and Japanese artists in Little Tokyo, downtown Attraction Avenue area, in which she was very close with Sam Francis and his wife Mako Idemitsu, and also this Japanese-American abstract painter Mike Kanemitsu. So I grew up in a very kind of small artistic community, not really knowing exactly what this was about, but always very curious with the exchange between Japan and or Tokyo and Los Angeles.
I want to come back now that we've had sort of the introduction to why now. What are the forces that are bringing this to the planetary alignment? And Mika, we've spoken about this reevaluation. Can you tie that into the studies that you're talking about?
Well, I think that the 70s is a prime period art historically, within the academy, especially, and also it filters into the institution as well. And there is no real, I think, narrative yet. And it is, as Paul Schimmel had pointed out, an age of pluralism. And with Harold Zamon's very profound exhibition, When Attitudes Become Form, I mean, I think after his death, there were a lot of publications that came out that were reevaluating his own legacy and that exhibition over the last few years.
Doryun, do you want to comment on what Mika said and also give us your ideas of why now, why this confluence is happening? Do you agree with this reevaluation idea?
Well, I think that's for sure. And clearly, this is coming out of the globalization of the art world and the art history as a discipline in general. But I think we're also realizing that, all this thinking has been done before. We're just doing it in different terms. So when you talk about retrenchment of the American museum world and or maybe Western in general, we're sort of...
Actually, it was American. I think Europe was sort of pretty active all along.
So we're kind of revising that afterwards. So I think we're all surprised by how international the museum thinking was in the 60s, right?
So Allan, can you bring us to the market? So we sort of heard what the reasons are academically and institutionally. What's happening in the market?
I think that the rise of interest in the market, let's start first with Gutai, because that's where the market has more to get hold of.
Yeah.
However, randomly. It happens because opportunities are shrinking in terms of finding works to sell and to acquire of known masterworks, first of American art from this generation of the 50s going to the 60s. And now as prices rise for the European art, which we were ignoring for decades, but then started looking at again in the last 10 years, all of a sudden the market's gaze starts to go in another direction. So I think you have a confluence of conditions. Within the last year, I've had Charagas offered to me at 3 times and 4 times the price that was being asked a year before. And I've probably had half a dozen dealers who had no link to this material before all of a sudden perk up and they hear Charaga, Motonaga, they hear, I mean, a lot of Gutai is not all that, there's not that much to develop in terms of commercial potential with certain of the artists, but certainly with Charaga there is. You have 5 decades of great painting.
Yeah.
And with Motonaga you have a substantial amount of work, I don't know about much of which, but some of which was shown in France, sold, collected in European collections, in the 60s and 70s already. So there's material that can emerge.
I just want to sum up a little bit what we've all been saying to answer the question of our panel of why this interest in post-war Japanese art now. And I think what we've heard is the rise of globalization as a philosophy, as a practice, as a reality, the growth of scholarship that has come out of that, and a younger generation building on work done in Japan as well as early work here in the United States, a reevaluation coming out of current interest in contemporary art, and the scarcity of materials, which reminds me there's an art fair on. So thank you all very, very much, and thanks to Art Basel for organizing this, and have a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you.